This is Shanna Severance, and the title of my paper is Using Clothing to Usurp Social Hierarchy in the Cask of Amontillado and the Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson. Edgar Allan Poe's The Cask of Amontillado, published in 1846, and Mark Twain's The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson, published in 1894, both have characters that wear clothing not representative of their place in the social hierarchy for the 19th century South. Such changes in attire, whether of their own choosing or of someone else's, lead to tragic endings in both selections, indicating how violently resistant society is to individuals' attempts to disrupt social echelons. In Pudd'nhead Wilson, Roxy unwittingly decides the tragic fates of her son and her master's son when she swaps the clothing on the two babies. At times throughout the novel, Roxy and her son choose to cross-dress to manipulate others. This too leads to tragic consequences, including murder. Pudd'nhead Wilson never changes the way he dresses, despite being dubbed a fool at the beginning of the story. At the end of the novel, he redeems his good name and reveals himself as the wisest man in Dawson's Landing. Similarly, in Poe's Cask of Amontillado, Fortunato's costume of carnival motley and clownish spells foreshadows his foolish behavior. A rich, respected, and admired aristocrat becomes an open, gullible extrovert whose naivete leads him to become a murder victim at the end of the story. His murderer, Montresor, also wears a costume, a black silk mask, and a roquelaire. Montresor's clothing enables him to betray his noble ancestry and aristocratic lineage and become an executioner. In both selections, characters are temporarily repositioned in the social hierarchy by wearing different clothing. However, the devastating results indicate that upsetting the 19th century social norms in the South is not a task to be taken lightly. Both Twain and Poe show the importance of dress through their descriptions of the ornamentation of houses and walls in their respective works. In the first chapter of Pudd'nhead Wilson, Twain establishes the notion that what is displayed on the exterior of something is of utmost importance. In his description of the homes of Dawson's Landing, he portrays the homes with wooden boxes on the window sills as being complete, and the cat on the ledge symbolizes contentment and peace. Twain describes the hamlet as being clothed with forest from foot to summit, thus characterizing the town by what it is wearing in the same way he will proceed to characterize the novel's main characters by what they wear. According to Linda A. Morris, Twain had a preoccupation with clothing that until recently has been virtually ignored in the critical history of Pudd'nhead Wilson. Morris argues that clothes as markers of identity, race, and gender is one of the major subtexts of the novel. Morris claims the text is rich with masquerading, with layering of clothing, with cross-dressing and misleading gender markers, with foppery, veiling, and unveiling, and with clothing as cues and miscues to sexual and racial identity. Similarly, as Montresor and Fortunato approach the end of the crypt in the Cask of Amontillado, Poe describes the walls as being lined with human remains, piled to the vault overhead in the fashion of the great catacombs of Paris. 3 sides of this interior crypt were still ornamented in this manner. The sizable mound of bones outside the recess helps to establish the grotesque mood of the story and foreshadows the horrific event which will occur at the tale's conclusion, just as the clothing the narrator, Montresor, and his nemesis, Fortunato, wears foreshadows each man's role in the event. Twain and Poe use characters in their works to demonstrate the theme that a character's speech, or what is said about a character, might not always reflect who he or she really is, but the clothes he or she wears can be voraciously telling. Although one would expect Roxy's skin to be black based on her manner of speech, to all intents and purposes, Roxy was as white as anybody. The clothing she wears, however, accurately reveals her slave position in society's hierarchy. Her head was bound about with a checkered handkerchief, and the hair was concealed under it. She was a slave, and sellable as such. Tom Driscoll, after being reared as Roxy's substitute slave son, has adopted the basest dialect of the Negro quarter. By the end of the novel, however, as his fine clothes indicate, he is a genuine white gentleman, the true heir of Percy Driscoll. Another character enters Dawson's Landing with the name David Wilson and is renamed Pudd'nhead Wilson by a group of citizens who misunderstand a remark he makes about silencing a barking dog. One of the citizens calls Wilson the downrightest fool in the world, when in actuality the citizens are the foolish ones because they are not intelligent enough to comprehend Wilson's dog anecdote. Roxana realizes that just because Wilson has been dubbed a fool doesn't mean he is one. She worries that he might discover her secret about how she switched Percy Driscoll's baby with her own. Even though Wilson adopts the nickname Pudd'nhead and finds himself unable to make his law practice thrive for more than 20 years because the community thinks he is stupid, he remains true to himself and resolved to live down his reputation and work his way into the legal field yet. Ultimately, dressed in clothes for business purposes, Wilson takes his place in the courtroom and exposes Roxy's ruse. Just as Wilson's clothing indicates, he is all business, as he solemnly announces, "The murderer of your friend and mine, York Driscoll, of the generous hand and the kindly spirit, sits in among you. Valet de chamber, Negro and slave, falsely called Thomas a Becket Driscoll, make upon the window the fingerprints that will hang you." Roxy's scheme begins and ends with Pudd'nhead. Wilson suggests that it is merely clothing that makes one child a nigger and the other a gentleman when he asks Roxy, "How do you tell them apart, Roxy, when they haven't any clothes on?" Her response, "Oh, I can tell 'em apart, Master Wilson, but I bet Marse Parcy couldn't, not to save his life," foreshadows the web of deception Roxy will begin weaving in just a few months' time. 23 years later, Wilson, using the plates of fingerprints he's painstakingly collected over the years, proves that baby A was put into B's cradle in the nursery. B was transferred to the kitchen and became a Negro and a slave. One day, as Roxy contemplates suicide after Pudd'nhead has opened her eyes to the importance of clothing, Roxy dresses herself in her new Sunday gown. She plans to drown herself and does not want everyone judging her by her shabby clothing when she is fished out. After removing the turban from her head and dressing her glossy wealth of hair like white folks, she considers herself ready for the tomb. Roxy intends to take her infant son to the grave with her, to spare him from someday being sold down the river. She strips him of his short little gray tow linen shirt and replaces it with one of Thomas à Becket's snowy, long baby gowns with its bright blue bows and dainty flummery of ruffles. With this symbolic gesture, Roxy has eliminated her baby's shameful pauper shabbiness and replaced it with the respected elegance of high society. Likewise, she strips Thomas à Becket and puts her own child's tow linen shirt on him. Upon seeing her son in the white child's finery, Roxy realizes she has moved the boy up the social ladder. She tells him, "You's young Marse Tom from dis out," and she feels sorry for Thomas à Becket, knowing she has moved him down a few rungs. "I's sorry for you, hun. I's sorry. God knows I is." Once Roxy switches the clothes on the two baby boys, each child's transformation occurs rapidly. After just 1 month of wearing Tom's clothes, Tom would cry for nothing, and burst into storms of devilish temper without notice, and let go scream after scream, and squall after squall. He became violent, clawing anybody who came within reach of his nails, and pounding anybody he could reach with his rattle. All the while, Chambers fades into the background, developing a meek and docile personality. According to Morris, Twain shows almost no interest in the white baby who is raised as a slave. Most of his attention is focused on the black baby raised as white. People treat others according to the clothes they wear. Roxy dotes on Tom and Chambers gets no attention. Tom got all the petting, Chambers got none. Roxy's mock reverence gradually becomes real devotion until she is the dupe of her own deceptions. Tom becomes Roxy's darling, her master, and her deity, all in one, and in her worship of him she forgot who she was and what he had been. Chambers learns to endure Tom's insults and seldom fights back. On 3 occasions, when Chambers retaliates, he receives 3 such convincing canings from the man who was his father and didn't know it, that he took Tom's cruelties in all humility after that, and made no more experiments. Even the townsfolk treat Tom differently when he returns home from Yale in Eastern attire. The young people are so repulsed by Tom's Eastern polish that he is forced to spend his days mainly without society. Despite their disapproval of Eastern dress, the citizens of Dawson's Landing are quite enamored with the Italian twins Luigi and Angelo because of their European style. As the twins arrive at the Cooper house, the narrator describes them as the handsomest, the best dressed, the most distinguished-looking pair of young fellows the West had ever seen. The widow proudly shows off her new boarders to her friends and neighbors, simple folk who had hardly ever seen a foreigner of any kind, and never one of any distinction or style. As the twins become acquainted with the various groups in the community, they encounter winning approval, compelling admiration, and achieving favor from all. Regardless of whether the wearer of the clothes feels worthy of donning them, he will continue to receive clothing-based treatment from others. Even after Roxy tells Tom that he is really Chambers in Tom's clothing, his white friends still extend their arms to shake his hand when they meet him. In response, Tom's arm hangs limp as the nigger in him asserts its humility, and he blushed and was abashed. Rowena invites Tom to come into her home, just as she always would, and Tom makes an embarrassed excuse and was afraid to enter and sit with the dread white folks on equal terms. Tom's feelings of inferiority upon learning of his true parentage are temporary. Before and after this incident, the clothes on Tom's back determine his self-image. As Eric Lott suggests in Mr. Clemens in Jim Crow, Tom's identity is precisely a black man's white-faced performance. Tom exhibits his assumed superiority to Chambers in boyhood by forcing him to drag a sled up a hill for him to ride down on, and making him carry his ice skates to the river for him and strap them on his feet. Tom throws snowballs at Chambers, and Chambers stands there patiently, performing his duty as the target. Chambers embraces his role of inferiority and never gets to participate in sledding, snowball throwing, or ice skating. Although Chambers possesses a superior physique and manifold cleverness, when Chambers saves Tom from drowning, Tom heaps insults upon Chambers for pretending to think he was in earnest and calling for help, and said that anybody but a blockhead nigger would have known he was funning and left him alone. Tom also believes himself to be superior to Roxy. She was merely his chattel now, his convenience, his dog, his cringing and helpless slave, the humble and unresisting victim of his capricious temper and vicious nature. In the presence of others, Tom strikes Roxy in the face and calls her names such as nigger, wench, and hussy. Although these physical assaults and verbal blows sting Roxy to the heart, she accepts her position as Tom's slave and lays aside her impotent rage. When Roxy learns of Tom's $200 gambling debt, she sends Chambers to ask Tom if she can have a word with him. The scene that ensues accurately depicts Tom's feelings of superiority over Chambers and Roxy. Tom looks upon Chambers with detest, and Tom's vicious gaze strikes Chambers with terror. Before receiving Roxy, Tom hits Chambers in the head 7 times and kicks him 3 times and sends him on his way. The pure white slave wordlessly accepts his beatings and limps away, mopping his eyes with his old ragged sleeve. Tom receives his mother with the customary amount of disrespect. "Cut it short, goddammit, cut it short. What is it you want?" At times in Pudd'nhead Wilson, Twain shows us that clothes once removed can have a lingering effect on the wearer. At age 19, Tom goes to Yale for 2 years. While there, he wears gloves and dresses in Eastern City fashion. Along with such clothes, Tom puts on better manners and takes to excessive drinking and gambling. When Tom returns to Dawson's Landing wearing his new duds and his new habits, the young fellows trick him into surrendering his clothes and clothing himself in the local fashion. The boys enlist a tailor to create a flamboyant curtain calico exaggeration of his finery, and they dress a deformed Negro bell ringer in the suit. Morris writes, in Baconian terms, the scene is carnivalesque, with the most lowly member of the community, the deformed Negro bell ringer, dressed in clothing intended to mock a member of the town's most privileged class. Hereafter, Tom forsakes his Eastern clothing, but he continues to participate in the practice of drinking and gambling that accompanied such dress. He was getting into deep waters. He was taking chances, privately, which might get him into trouble some day. In fact, did. Both Tom and Roxy resort to cross-dressing as a powerful and successful offense against the social order. Tom resorts to stealing to pay off the gambling debts he has accrued. He commits the acts of thievery under the disguises of a young girl and an old woman. Tom's convincing performance is one of the factors that prolongs the discovery of Percy Driscoll's murderer. Morris writes, in spite of his reputation as being a puddin'-head, David Wilson is a shrewd and discerning man. If he is unable to see beyond Tom's cross-gendered disguise, who can? After Roxy's own son sells her down the river into slavery to pay his creditors and keep from being disinherited by his father, Roxy returns to Dawson's Landing, cross-dressed as a man, putting on men's clothing and an old slouch hat and blackening her face to avoid detection. As Roxana takes off her hat and lets her hair fall down around her shoulders, she reveals her true identity to Tom and the reader. Morris explains, now she stands before Tom and before us as a white woman in blackface dressed in men's clothes. At this critical moment in the text, Roxana embodies us all, black and white, man and woman. Tom cross-dresses again to escape the house undetected after murdering his uncle. He commits the murder wearing his own clothes except for his hat, and he has blackened his face. Before leaving, he puts on his girl clothes over his male clothes, drops a veil over his blackened face, and flees from the house. Tom's layering in this scene collapses all categories of socially constructed identities. Just as Twain intricately weaves clothing with identity in Pudd'nhead Wilson, apparel is deeply symbolic in Poe's The Cask of Amontillado. Poe gives great attention to detail as he describes the clothing of the two characters Fortunato and Montresor. As Montresor approaches Fortunato about dusk one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season, he sees that the man wears motley. He had on tight-fitting party strip dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells. When Fortunato takes Montresor's arm to accompany him down into the catacombs, Montresor tells the reader he puts on a mask of black silk and draws a roquelaire closely about his person. Not only does Poe describe the clothing at the beginning of the story, but throughout the brief tale, he mentions the bells 5 times and the roquelaire cloak 3 times. David S. Reynolds writes, in Poe's Art of Transformation, the jingling of the bells reminds us of the fool Fortunato has become because of his destructive obsession. As Fortunato falls deeper and deeper into Montresor's trap, the repetition of jingling bells serve as a visual and audible reminder to the reader that Fortunato is a fool, and the repeated mention of Montresor's cloak foreshadows his villainous act at the end of the story. Fortunato becomes the embodiment of his clownish costume by behaving foolishly. Montresor tells the reader that Fortunato has the reputation of a rich, respected, and admired aristocrat. However, Fortunato is broadly drawn as a character entirely befitting his carnival motley and clownish bells. He appears as the open, gullible extrovert, an innocent possessed of the same ignorant vanity that caused the original fall from grace. He thinks he knows enough to sample the apple and the serpent tempts him with. Poe first exposes Fortunato's naivete during his conversation with Montresor about the Montresor family arms. After Fortunato inquires about the Montresor's arms, Montresor describes a huge human foot d'or in a field azure. The foot crushes a serpent rampant with fangs are embedded in the heel. Fortunato is blind to the irony that Montresor is the serpent about to embed his fangs in Fortunato. Neither does Fortunato recognize the numerous clues Montresor parades before him, signaling his impending doom. He does not realize that what is happening to him is Montresor's revenge for the 1,000 injuries and insults Fortunato has bestowed on him. The costume Montresor wears enables him to proceed with executioner-esque behavior. Although he is of noble ancestry and aristocratic lineage, he exhibits monstrous behavior after he puts on the black mask and cloak. Zachary Bennett notes in Killing the Aristocrats that Montresor's name is a near anagram of monster. Derived from the Latin root more, to warn, the word monster has been used since the mid-16th century to denote a person of inhuman cruelty or wickedness. The semantic clues in the story tend to verify the assumption that the snake, not the foot, represents Montresor's. Montresor has been stepped on by Fortunato for the last time, and now he will settle for no less than lethal vengeance. As previously mentioned, clothing at times can have residual effects upon a person even after he has changed clothes. We see this with Montresor as he struggles to place the last stone in the wall around Fortunato. He says, "I struggled with its weight." More likely, he is struggling with the barbaric act of murder he is committing and its opposition to his former noble self. Ultimately, the black mask and cloak take over as he forces the last stone into position and plasters it up. Prior to the middle or late 19th century, when Poe and Twain wrote The Cask of Amontillado and Pudd'nhead Wilson, most people wore what were essentially uniforms, garments denoting the one form or single shape to which each individual's life was confined by birth, circumstance, custom, or decree. These authors were certainly aware of the power the democratization of clothing held to pull civilization down rather than lifting the proletariat up. Through their works and by their characters, each author demonstrates that human beings are, to an extent, what they wear, and it is possible to change one's station in life by changing his or her clothing. However, the centuries-old social hierarchy is quite resistant to change, and tampering with it can result in undesirable outcomes, like being sold down the river or left for dead.